Yes. Welcome everyone to a new session of Room for Discussion. Um, 2 weeks ago, Nelly Kroes high-fived Matthijs van Nieuwkerk in the Dutch talk show De Wereld Draait Door, and she said Amsterdam will be in the top 3 of startup cities in the coming 4 months. And Amsterdam is doing well. It has already been nicknamed Silicon Canals after Silicon Valley, and it's ranking number 19 in the world as startup city, and it's the fourth of Europe after London, Berlin, and Paris. And during the end of May, StartUpDelta, a Dutch government initiative to promote startups, is organizing Startup Fest, where Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, and Travis Kalashnik, the CEO of Uber, will attend. And all these things are kind of examples of the hype around startups. You're hearing a lot of things about them, and we have heard a lot of about them in the past years. And today we want to discuss that hype and also the importance of startups with two guests. First, Alexander Ribbink worked at Mars and Unilever, was CEO, Chief Operations Officer at TomTom, and now he is investor at Keen Venture Partners. Next to him will be Constantijn van Oranje-Nassau, who was Chief of Staff of Nelly Kroes when she was EU Commissioner for the Digital Agenda. And now he's, among other things, an advisor to that Startup Delta. And we want to discuss 3 topics with them today. First, what is actually a startup? What makes a startup? What's the difference between a normal company and a startup, a multinational and a startup, etc. Their personal experience, how did they end up working with startups and why are they enjoying it? And what do startups actually contribute to Dutch society? What do we outside of Amsterdam benefit from startups? Of course, there's a lot to talk about, but we also want to hear your input. So if you have any questions, please walk up to Bjorn with the microphone, or if you're in front of the audience, just raise your hand and we will come up to you. You can also use Twitter and use hashtag RFD. Yeah, that's it. Let's begin. But first, round of applause for Alexander Ribbink and Constantijn van Oranje-Nassau.
Nog een handgeven? Geen
Ja.
handgeven.
Hello.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
Welcome.
So, welcome. First question. In the Metro of last week, we could read that 3 startups are still in the running to win $1 million in the Challenge World Cup, a competition for startups. Skytree, Chem2, and Procter Exam. So we were first wondering, Mr. Ribbing, do you know these startups? Have you considered investing in them?
No, and I hope this is not a bad start of today's performance, but I've not heard of these startups, and I haven't considered investing in them either.
Okay. Well, we will hear about plenty of other startups you are investing in later on in this interview, I guess. But then, Mr. Van Oranje-Nassau, do you think it was the first time that this competition was organized in Amsterdam? Do you think that your and Nelly Kroes' efforts have contributed to getting the organization to also start a startup competition in the Netherlands in any way?
Well, I think you have to be very careful claiming success, but I do think that a lot of initiatives have been taken to highlight what's going on here. Mm-hmm. And I think Amsterdam is doing a lot, but all of the Netherlands is doing a lot. I mean, I think one of the objectives of StartUpDelta is also not just to look at Amsterdam. Amsterdam is a brilliant brand for all the Dutch startup activity, but there's a lot going on in Rotterdam, Delft, Twente, Eindhoven, all across the Netherlands. So, and what's really fun about the whole thing is that you actually now start seeing all the good stuff that's going on, and it's much more than just the app and the gaming activities that you see around here, but it's a lot of hard tech also in the rest of the Netherlands. And so there will be many startups you've never heard of, but you need to build the ecosystem, and you need to build the networks, and a competition like that or international events are very helpful because they focus attention of international investors, but also of talent, that something is going on here in Amsterdam and in the Netherlands that's worthwhile. So they might actually maybe consider investing here or establishing their business here or looking for talent here. And so I think it's a compliment that international activities come over here.
Yeah, we
Very
want to
good.
focus on that later on. Let's first start with setting the scene, because you already mentioned that a startup is not only that app that you see out there, but it's more. And we want to pin down some kind of a definition of what a startup is to start with. So, Mr. Ribbink, in what kind of companies do you invest? What kind of key factors do they need before you put money in them?
I mean, there's many factors to consider, but to start with a number of obvious ones. I think one is what I'd call proprietary technology. And I'm an investor in tech companies, so I'll focus mostly on tech. And then I like companies where really clever people, and not just, if you will, computer programmers, but lots of other intelligent people, work together to solve a solution, to solve a problem, and that they come up with a real solution. That sounds a bit obvious, but I think it's a critical thing. I like proprietary technology. I look at the team. Is the team, have they got the real experience that they need to bring this to success? Are they complementary to each other? And of course, is it a real problem? Is the problem big enough either to make money with or to solve an issue for someone else? Those are the key things, the team, and is it a real problem that you can at some point monetize?
Mm-hmm. And these people, I imagine you speak to a lot of different people in this scene, Mr. Van Oranje. What kind of people do start a startup? What kind of culture is there around this, around startups?
Okay, so I think there's a lot of hype around startups, and you have everything from the ZZP'er. I'm a ZZP'er myself. I wouldn't call myself a startup. You have the mom and pop store around the corner. You have, if somebody starts a bakery or a shop, that's great. I mean, it's in a sense a startup, but that's not what it's about. It's about do you want to scale that? Do you have the ambition to grow it relatively fast? Also about how you finance it. Do you finance for growth, or do you finance basically for you can have a lifestyle kind of business, which is also fine. A lot of people do that. So, but I do think there's a distinction there. So you have people that also do the lifestyle thing in startups, which is I think already fine, because when I got out of university, everybody would go to the big corporates. You'd either go to a law firm or you go to Unilever, or you go to a bank, or you go to Heineken, and then you had the second tier of companies that you'd go to. But nobody really would consider starting a business if you were not from Delft or some other technical university. And that's changed now, and I think you see also in schools already that kids are learning to be entrepreneurs much younger. So I wouldn't have any judgment on that. I think it's really good that everybody gives it a try. Then you have serious startups that are people that are really dedicated to work 24/7 to get their idea to the market. And bring together the right people, try to get capital, try to grow internationally. It's a different kettle of fish, but luckily enough, we have enough fish in the pond, and we're growing the pond.
Mm-hmm. And usually these people are not necessarily nice people. Huh? I'm not saying that every startup or entrepreneur is an unlikable person, but these are relatively stubborn people that don't necessarily listen to what the market has been telling them every day, because otherwise you're not going to innovate, you're not going to change things. If you just do what everybody was doing before, you could be having a business, but it will not grow very fast. So, I think that's an essential. They're stubborn people, and they're usually quite. Some people would say they're arrogant as well. I'm not saying that's correct, but they have most of the good ones have a real vision. They try and solve something. They try and make something that they believe, and usually they start with one person believing it themselves, and then trying to convince other people to join them in believing it. And then in hindsight, looking back, it all looks like, yeah, of course we'll all be using WhatsApp, or of course Uber, or whatever or of course TomTom, whatever. But the point is, in the beginning, it's a relatively, lonely experience. Now, it's nice if you could do it with two other people, or but then you have to deal with those other people as the company grows as well, and sometimes that can, lead to huge fights. Anyway, it's if you're not a lifestyle entrepreneur. And there's in the Netherlands, if anything, there's too many people that are lifestyle entrepreneurs, maybe.
What is a lifestyle entrepreneur?
A lifestyle entrepreneur is, I make enough money to have a good lifestyle.
Okay.
But actually, I could be building a company that employs lots of more people. That could be generating much more tax. That could be generating much more, even personal wealth, for myself. But No, actually, it's good enough as it is. I have 20 people, I have 50 people, I have some turnover, and thank you very much. And that's a little bit of the, if there's any criticism today of the Dutch, and of course the Dutch are wonderful, but it's a shame that some of the good ideas don't get to be made huge.
Big enough.
Big enough.
And because you were both mentioning scale and growth, why is that so important to a startup?
Well, to sort of, it's an assumption of current society that growth is essential, and that's a nice philosophical debate for a different faculty as such. I'm here because I assume that growth is part of who we are and what we want to do, and so if you decide not to grow and you can, you're actually, in my opinion, going backwards or standing still. And if you stand still, other people will overtake you. So I assume that growth is critical. And I think growth is critical as well because opportunity is big. If the opportunity is big, you should just go towards that opportunity. And I think for the Netherlands, just sitting here as a Dutch citizen, if a company can grow bigger than it does, it's someone else will take it. Whether it's a Belgian, a Frenchman, a Russian, or an American, why not have it here? It's a simple. So if you can grow, grow.
Okay, and if we bring an example to the table for growth, Uber, which is a very big company already, has a lot of money. Are they still a startup? Would you consider them a startup? Because they're growing fast, for example, in China.
I don't think. I think it's semantics. I don't think it's really relevant. I think what they do have, and what even a Google will say they have, is a startup mentality. They're creating. The way they manage their teams is very agile. They support speed. Speed is important, creativity is important, and so they try to avoid all the traps of a big corporate where you have procedure is important and where structure becomes important and where you have KPIs and all kinds of things that take away the individual creativity. So if you look at an Uber, they will work in small teams. They're very purpose driven. There's an overall purpose, but within that purpose, they can do a specific task, and there's a lot of opportunity for experimentation, for innovation, for testing, and that's different than in a corporate. So if you go to Uber to their headquarters if you have a chance in San Francisco, you'll find that it looks very much like all the startups, and it's still a young company. You have all the coffee machines, and you have the open space, and you have a lot of very, very high dynamics. And I think if the challenge will be for corporates to be much more like that, and the challenge for growing startups, scale-ups, or whatever you call them, is to retain that kind of culture. Also because that is what attracts people and talent, and that's what keeps you agile.
Okay. And this mentality is very important. This growth is very important. Are there questions on this definition, or maybe other questions you want to involve you as well as an audience right now?
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question. You were also calling a startup a scale-up. Why is scaling it so important? We've had many problems with too big companies, like banks becoming too big, increasing more risk. What is wrong with a company having a medium size, generating decent taxes without taking too much risk?
I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's also, I mean. But the opportunity is there, like Alexander said, there's opportunities there. So, and with many of the businesses, especially where there's a network functionality, if you don't become the big player, you'll be the loser. I mean, you cannot be, Hives cannot survive, and it didn't survive, even though it was a very, very nice company and was did great stuff. It just, you will fold and die. So if you want to compete in that market, if you can't secure yourself a niche, then there's no real option. Right. So if you want to start a restaurant chain, then that's no problem. You can stay small. You can decide if I'm just going to stay in Amsterdam, or I'm going to roll out and become Starbucks. I don't know if you can do the bitterballen shop, and you can roll out the world, with bitterballen if you want. That there's an option there. But if you are more in the internet, then you don't really have a chance or a choice.
Are there also startups outside of the internet, would you say? Because you say...
Yeah, everywhere.
Yeah, of course,
Of
everywhere.
everywhere.
I mean, there is the exploit. You know, there's people that have fitness centers that are starting from 1, and now they have 300, and they're gonna whatever bring it to the stock exchange. So startup isn't. I mean, in my opinion, a startup is mostly to do with technology. But you could argue that anyone who starts something that can grow exponentially is a startup in the beginning. I would argue that at some point, when someone has a couple of million euros of turnover, that you stop being a startup. I support the idea of the culture and the mentality, but I would argue that Uber is not a startup anymore. It has found its business model. It's expanding still. But it is, you know, the risk of failure, which for me is part of the startup thinking, is actually gone. I mean, lots can happen to them in legal terms or in, you know, in competition terms, but fundamentally, we all understand their business model and they show us that they can make it work. Now, whether their valuation is in any way linked to their business model is a different question, but fundamentally, it's not a startup anymore, in my opinion.
I think it's somewhere you have to also get a steady revenue stream, and you have to get kind of profits as well. And at least you get profits that you either then reinvest them or you actually show them and you share them with your shareholders. But you see a lot of startups that are that they do not have a business model yet that generates that revenue stream because they're just going after market share. I think it's an important ingredient, because once you got a steady income stream going, then different challenges arise, and you have to manage a steady state as well as growing really fast. Once you're established also in the market, things come up like, you know, how do I relate to my environment? How do I relate to the government? So there were very few startups will have corporate affairs, or even, you know, they will have sales force, but maybe won't have marketing. So you have a lot of the corporate functions then start becoming important, and that's the point where you have to start managing the culture and not becoming too corporate. But and that's also where you can say, well, you're maybe not a startup anymore because you are actually, you know, dealing with kind of corporate problems.
And there's also, just to go back to the question of scale up and startups, I mean, if you look at the statistics on startups, they actually look quite horrendous from a certain point of view. Many fail. We hear of the ones and we speak of the ones that make it big, but percentage-wise, I think it's well below, you know, I think 5% that make it anywhere. Even, you know, I think 10% make it to scale up. So your issue or your question or, you know, your position on huge companies, you know, I think if you have 100 startups, I think you'll end up with 10 scale-ups, and I think maybe one will make it into big, and never mind what big exactly means. So just in simple terms, for any economy, you need many startups to have a couple of scale-ups, to have one or two, you know, Philips's come out, or Nokia's, or, you know, you can mention other companies. So in that sense, the role of scale-ups is huge, is important as well, because again, from those scale-ups, only one or two will make it biggest. Do you see? It's like a funnel that you go through.
So currently, we can kind of speak of a hype surrounding all these startups, but if this is a very broad concept, and we were just wondering, what do you both think is causing this current hype?
I'm not sure it's a hype. I mean, the word is used often, and we sit here talking in an hour about, you know, it doesn't mean that it's a hype per se. I think the hype side could be if you look at some of the valuations, how much people think some of these companies are worth, and then you see no turnover, let alone profit, and then you see, that may be hype. There's maybe hype in that. But I think, and as Constantijn said earlier, I think entrepreneurship per se, which is what I think, when I hear startup, I think of technology a little bit, but in general, it's about entrepreneurship. I think, if anything, it's good that a country or a society thinks of entrepreneurship and gives it its role, you know, amongst the forces of capital and labor and all those good things, and says, okay, how much entrepreneurship do we want? How much do we want, you know, want to change our society to enable it? And I think that, in the Netherlands at least, it's not too late. I mean, it's good that we have a little bit of extra attention for entrepreneurship and in general. And I think, therefore, it's not a hype. It's good to speak about it, but don't expect miracles either, if only for the simple reasons of the 100 startups, 10 scale-ups, and one big company. So I don't think it's a hype. There's some hype in some of the valuations. Otherwise, I think it's good that we sit here and that we address it openly and publicly, and think about entrepreneurship in general, because it is, again, personal opinion, the engine of our economy.
Question here, and then we move on to the next part.
Yes, I would wonder how we position the orange Dutch delta and the blue European continent. Let me explain. You talked about the frame, you talked about lifestyle entrepreneurs. We have a lot of technologies, and you talked about the fishes. But now I wonder, we are as well a water country. How big is our sea, our lake, or our ocean? And how do we enlarge our ocean where our fishes can swim in?
Yeah, okay, so I'm not a fisherman, but...
But your brother is.
Is he? A waterman. Yeah, a waterman is something
Are there
else.
any environment-related startups? Maybe.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna abuse your question a bit. I think if you look at StartUpDelta, the first ambition was to get the Netherlands to work together better. And so it's not Amsterdam, it's not Utrecht. It's really remarkable how Utrecht is not Hilversum, and Hilversum is not Aalsmeer, and Aalsmeer is not Amsterdam. Whereas in the bigger scheme of things, I've got this photo where you see that basically Silicon Valley reaches from Den Helder to Maastricht. Chicago is about half the Netherlands, New York as well. So I mean, if you see it in that perspective, we are really much too petty, and we should look more at the Netherlands as one big ecosystem, and that would be possible. Then it's still a very little speck on the whole world map, and in Europe it's still quite small. So what we also did was kind of pitch it as the west coast of Europe. I think it's really important that we think much more about how the Netherlands can be the landing place for foreign investment into Europe and expansion. So we find a lot of companies that could come here because it's a good testing ground. We have quite a pragmatic way of dealing with business.
Highly skilled people.
And highly skilled people, mostly also bilingual. So really good place to do business. So come here if you want to go to Europe, but also if you want to go to the rest of the world, come through the Netherlands. That's basically one of the pitches. So we have to look at Flanders and the Ruhrgebiet and everywhere. We see how can we connect to them. So not to think too parochial. We talk about the environment. I think it's one of those things where the Netherlands should be really good, and we think that we are very environmentally friendly. But on all the benchmarks, we perform pretty poorly. Which is incomprehensible to me, and I think it's also a shame, because we have a lot of the technologies, and we have our energy pact, and we have all of these things, and I think we could do much more to play a leading role in Europe, and I think entrepreneurship is one of the things we should add to that. Not NGOs, not government, but really how can you make business out of green concepts.
Great.
How the startups can benefit all the people in Europe and the world. And that role, how do you look at that, really, as a society?
Well, that's a huge question, and I'm sure my answer will be insufficient. But there's two ways, simple ways of addressing that. If you look at, on the one hand, technology being used in many different ways already, in many places, many cities around Europe actually, to get the people that have the most difficulty in obtaining a good income, so what are usually called poor people, There's lots of apps and there's lots of marketplaces being developed at the moment to make sure that someone who could benefit from subsidies or other aid are actually being linked to those marketplaces so that they know all the rights that they have. Because in our welfare societies, poverty is still a real issue, but actually the access to the help is, people are bewildered, and poor people, and there is no better word, so that's what I'll use, poor people have difficulty accessing the help that's available to them. There's lots of technology, apps and other things being developed already and implemented in some places to get these people to access to it. So that's a small answer to a huge problem. What you see on the other side is that you see philanthropy. Now in the Netherlands, philanthropy is not necessarily a good word, but it is, if you look at Zuckerberg, if you look at Bill Gates, just take those examples, they apply the mindset of an innovator, not just of an entrepreneur, but of an innovator, of people who are used to changing things and then use data to actually measure the impact of what they want to change and then stop when they don't get the results that they want. And I think that's another side of, let's say, the wealth that's been created in the space of tech. And if you see how the Gates Foundation is using, are using the resources that they've created for the benefit of mankind. And it's also for a simple reason, because they have more money than their children to the nth degree could ever spend. But still, they're doing it, and they're doing it in a very efficient way, I believe. What I know of the Gates Foundation is quite efficient. If I look at Zuckerberg, including the structure that he's chosen, like the widow of Steve Jobs has chosen structure, I think those are interesting and good approaches where you see the money generated by entrepreneurs and technology being applied to real societal issues. And I think that is the great thing about, be it entrepreneurs or be it technology, you can use those as well on the other side to solve real issues. I don't think Twitter has solved a real issue for me personally, or Facebook for that matter, but the wealth that's been created and that's now being used to create or to solve real issues, I think is really fantastic.
Thank you. So we might have to suspect these stubborn entrepreneurs are idealists a little bit. Maybe. But so for you personally, what has triggered your interest?
What's your definition of an idealist?
Someone who is convinced that he has the right solution for a societal problem that he wants to solve, and then.
But if you have the solution, then are you a realist? Or I always think that idealists kind of puts people aside because they are dreamers. And I think if you have a purpose, which could be an ideal or whatever, and a high kind of purpose, because Uber has a high purpose, Tesla has a high purpose. You cannot call Tesla an idealistic company. I mean, they're making. I mean, they're investing heavily and they want to make a big profit, but they also want to electrify mobility.
But I think there's a point, I think part of, and you should be giving this answer, but I think part of, there's a certain loneliness. There's a certain loneliness in the beginning of something.
Yeah, but I mean, realists can be lonely too. No, I just think, idealist is not the right word. I think purpose is the right, is a good concept. I think ambition is a good concept. And if you put those two together, it could be that you have a certain leap of faith because you believe in that you can actually come to the solution, like cleaning up the plastic soup, But it's not because you dream of I'm an idealist, I'm going to change the world. No, I've got a real solution that tackles a real problem, and I know how to scale this. If you do that, then I don't see that as an idealist. I think then you are a purpose-driven entrepreneur.
Is that why you like working with these kind of people? Is that why you went to
these kind of people? Yeah,
well,
nice
really driven idealists.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, driven people, and the same applies whether to sports, men or women. I mean, that's not the point. But driven people are fantastic people because they are going, and never mind you. And never mind your opinion either. This is what I'm trying to do. This is what I'm trying to achieve. By the way, as an investor, some of these people are therefore also difficult to handle. And therefore, when we make our investment decisions, you also look at, we'll give money and we'll try and give advice, but will they ever listen? They'll take the money, but will they listen to the advice as well? And if we're convinced that they will never listen to the advice, then usually we will not invest because we think that you need to at least have a dialogue. It doesn't mean that someone has to do what you tell them. So anyway, there's a limit to how stubborn someone should be or can be.
But just to your point, I come from government. I was outside government, came back to government, and when I took over Nelly's team, there was. And in the process leading up to that, we say, well, we had budgets for doing research in software, 40 million to do research in software, and we had for everything basically. And so I asked the question, well, why are we spending 40 million in research and software? I mean, this is it would be spent maybe in Amsterdam, I don't know, in all kinds of universities in Europe. And then the answer was, well, we don't have a Facebook. We said, what the 40 million is not going to bring you anything. So what is the right strategy to get the Facebooks and the Googles, emerging from Europe? I think it is to grow the pie and have more people developing. And so why don't we just we don't start at the money side. We started where the innovators are. Find the innovators, empower them, see what they need. And we came up with what we needed was role models. We needed, so Nelly went all over Europe to go to the hackathons, to the places where the innovators were. And the innovators are in healthcare, they are in education, they are all where you can always find, and they're always fighting the same battles. They're fighting the battles against the incumbent interest, the incumbent structures, the incumbent cultures. And by empowering those people, by saying, well, I'm not a nutcase. In Brussels, they might also be nuts, but at least I got nuts in Brussels that agree with me that I'm not crazy. So we try to empower people to be the change agents, and that's very soft. It sounds very soft. But in the end, it's much more stimulating to work with people that want to change the things for the better, that are entrepreneurs, that take the risk, that want to do something. Instead of, as a politician or a government people, you write laws and you come up with policies, and you're basically always asking somebody else to do something, or you're forcing them. And these people are actually delivering on their own ambition, and they're actually creating something, and that's why it's very stimulating to work with entrepreneurs. I find.
Yeah. Also, it's by definition, therefore, a relatively individual exercise. It's a recognition, what you say, of the limits, if you will, of public policy, where most things that actually change current structures have to be changed by individuals, whether it's angry professors or angry students or a certain amount of anger, by the way, is quite essential. I once invested in a company which is called Sint, and in Norwegian that means angry, and it's started by a guy who was maltreated according to him in an airplane, and he got off the plane and said, I'm going to found a company, I'm going to do this and this and this, and I'm going to call it Sint, because he was angry in Norwegian. It was a Swedish company, don't know how that mixed up, but I mean, that's a different story. So a certain amount of anger is essential to overcome all those barriers as well. I know.
So, but for both of you, it's this passion that links you with these non-idealist but practical entrepreneurs. So, why not start another startup of your own, or are you not angry about anything at this moment?
This is all dangerous. A 50-year-old man. You're. No, I think. I mean, I think fundamentally, I don't think of myself as an entrepreneur on the one hand. So I'm not necessarily the best guy to go from 0 to 1, and that's not what I've done at TomTom either. By the way, I've helped TomTom from 1 further, which is a different mentality and a different. So I think that's one, and I think that what I can do best as where I am with my experience and with my talents is help people that want to grow further. So I'm actually not necessarily investing in startups either. I'm actually trying to find the scale-ups, the companies that have 1 to 2, 3 million turnover, but that no bank will ever give any loans because they are high risk according to the bank and they have no assets.
Do you have an example, maybe, of a company you're investing in currently?
Well, there's a company, I mean, this is my previous company that I worked at, a company called Greets, which are greeting cards, yeah? And this company, it has way more than 10 million euro turnover, and still they went to a bank and they could get a loan for 300,000 euro. A company that has 10 million euro turnover. I'm not blaming the banks for this. They have their rules and the things, but it means that there is, a 10 million euro company, and they made no profit, but that's because they spent 1.5 million on marketing. So if you turn off the marketing, you have 1.5 million of profit. Okay. The fact that companies like that cannot get money at banks is an opportunity for investors. So Greets is they make greeting cards and they send presents, personalized.
It's good.
I have no interest. I have no commercial interest whatsoever. But I take your point.
It's a huge risk then for a bank. Should we even want banks to invest in that?
No, I'm not saying. No, that's what I'm saying. It in the most neutral way, and I mean that seriously. I'm not blaming banks for not investing in those type of companies per se. But there's only an issue if there is no middle layer then, called private equity or venture capital, where people take a lot higher risk and all, in return for a lot higher return. I mean, that's a bank makes 6 or 7 or 8% of interest. And of course, if you invest in tech companies, you want to make, lots more, because of the 10 investments that you do, 2 go bankrupt, 3 or 4 give back your money after 7 years, which is not a great return. And then 2 or 3 have to do all the work for all the other failures, if you will, to give the investors their money back. So, and a bank, is not an investment company. They just want stable returns, or they should want that, because it ends up our money, if you see what I mean. Anyway, I'm not sure where.
But banks are not investing in startups because the risk is too high. You are also not investing in actual startups because the risk is too high. So who is investing in the actual startups?
I'm just being very particular. There are lots of people investing in startups. And the first phase in a startup is, by the way, it's friends and family, and sometimes they say fools as well, the 3 Fs. So if you start up a company, you go to your friends, you go to your family, and I won't dwell on the other F, but on those 3, you get your money from. And since it's high risk, high reward, you risk, having some angry anniversaries later on if your venture goes upside down. But if it goes well, everybody's happy, of course. And then there's actually quite a few people who do invest in startups in the Netherlands. But that's a particular area.
Yeah, you have angel investors, you have seed funds, university usually have tech transfer funds.
Exactly.
So, but you also, I think, have to be careful that you don't dilute yourself too early. So you have companies actually grow pretty fast and they're completely bootstrapped, and they they are paying their growth from their income, and they are finding financing from the fools and the family, but not diluting their ownership. Because otherwise, what does happen if you want to grow too early, you give away too much of your equity
for too little.
For too little. And you see this as well with acceleration programs. Sometimes you have 3 months of acceleration, and then you already lose up to 7% or even more of your equity, which is a lot. And later on, you may think, if you ever go on that trajectory, you think, well, why have I given away so much money at the beginning for so little?
Do you understand the concept?
Yes.
So there's sometimes people with a PowerPoint and they say, my business is worth 2 million. It's a startup and it's worth 2 million. So if you want to buy 50, if you want to put some money in me, this is what valuation it will be. And if you do so, it could easily, someone who would put money in that, will say, okay, give me 50% of your company, because there is no proof. I believe you on your blue eyes, but there's no proof that you will deliver on this. And to the point of Constantijn, if indeed your idea is as big as it seems, then you will have lost half of your company, which is a huge, but that's a lot given away very early. So that's a tricky thing. If you have no money and you need money, but anyway.
And what is the Dutch government and the European Union doing to help facilitate these investments, or?
What is it doing, or what could it be doing?
Yes.
I think different governments have found different ways through tax or through subsidies or creating funds of funds. So there are different ways. Basically, you can grow the funding pool. You can reduce regulation. That's good not only for startups but for every business. You can make it easier to hire people. So migration comes into play. How do you make it easy to get talent to your company, and how can you retain them? How do you pay them? So if you don't have money, you pay usually with options. So the tax regime should facilitate that from happening. If it doesn't, then you basically just can't get the people. So there are a lot of things a government can do that are within the realm of government. For instance, procurement. You can procure from startups, so be a launching customer. The government has multiple billions every year it spends on public procurement. And
is this the Dutch government or
any government?
Okay.
So and you have a choice. You can buy, like I say, you buy from IBM. Nobody gets fired if you bought from IBM. or if you procure from McKinsey, but you could also procure from a small company. And a startup company be a launching customer, or you can take a percentage of procurement budget and spend it on these companies. So there's a lot the government can do. I think the government shouldn't try to do they kind of create companies or do the kind of things that they can't do well. I mean, a government should not run, I believe, a venture capital firm. I mean, they can put capital in an existing venture capital firm, but to try a VC, for instance, for a government is probably not very wise.
But I think that all of that is correct. But I think what a government or a state can do, which is equally important, is very much about a culture, about being a country where people, just as a Dutchman now, where people want to come, where there is an openness to innovation or to growth, or access to technology is high, where you have a population that is generally very well educated, where you have universities where there is indeed, again, an openness and a willingness to try, a willingness to experiment. And I'm not saying that every university should be commercializing everything, because some things are about truth and others about money, but still at universities. And in that sense, I think the Netherlands as such, and then there's stupid things. They may sound stupid, but infrastructure. People love the fact that we are an extremely connected country. That Schiphol is at 15 minutes from Amsterdam or an hour from Eindhoven, which to Dutchmen seems like an hour, but for most other people in the world, that's fantastic. If you have so all of those things, and if you will, general prices levels, wages, so internet, the broadband penetration. All of those statistics, or if you just look at our, general education level. So I think those things, plus a cultural thing about, how do you work? Will you work hard? Will you work long? In general, I think make us now very parochial Dutch, a relatively attractive place to do business in.
I think you mentioned one word, experiment. I think there where government is not very good at experimenting. We tend to kind of want
Yes, because I was wondering, what is StartUpDelta now doing of all these things that you guys are mentioning? Which
well, there's
things are
a lot,
the
but
projects?
let me just finish my point on experimenting. I think governments like to reduce risk. They're very risk-averse organizations. But it's in the experimenting where you can actually enable new ideas to come up. And actually, in an experiment, it's very limited. So actually, your risk is much lower. You can experiment, and once you see it's successful, you can then start investing deeper. And governments can do much more to create that culture. Also, for instance, if you look at if you want self-driving cars, you have to allow a space for that to happen. You have to allow new ideas to actually test themselves in the market before, instead of having all kinds of regulations that forbid that from happening. So we do tend in the Netherlands and in many countries, I think if there's an issue, immediately we come with new regulations, new rules, and you try to organize everything. Sometimes, you need to have create some space as well for things to fail and for things to be tested. So that I think is important. So StartUpDelta was set out to do a few things. One is to increase the access to capital, is to increase the access to talent, and is to strengthen the network of startups and the whole basically ecosystem in the Netherlands of startups, and to raise awareness. So it's done a lot about awareness raising, also about awareness raising in the international startup scene. So people now acknowledge that there's a lot going on in Amsterdam and a lot going on in the Netherlands. That's important. Nelly's done a lot to talk to the Ministry of Finance, on the tax side, on these things of the options, also with the pension funds to see if they would want to collaborate more to invest more money. For them, it's peanuts money. That's what sometimes difficult to actually manage it, because they only talk about hundreds of millions instead of sometimes you maybe just need 50 million, which is a lot of money already. But to invest that more in funds that are available in VC funds. So that's been going on. Schengen startup visa is something that they've been lobbying strongly for in Brussels, so that people that are startups that are not employed, because everything is always geared around employment, but this is a startup, you're self-employed, that you can actually travel freely through Europe. So we're doing a lot in that sphere, and basically what you're trying to do is to go out to the community, listen what's going on there, feed that back to the government and say, well, these are the things that the community would like to see happening to make it easier to do business.
Okay, and how do then we here as students benefit from that? Because we all pay, or we or our parents pay taxes, and we are paying for all these initiatives that
You're not.
You're not.
we're not. Okay,
No.
who is?
No. So the question, since you're not paying for it,
Yeah.
no, I was about to ask, what are you going to do in order to make the Netherlands a better startup country? No, and I think, I think what you will, in terms of, let's continue with your question, how you can benefit from all this is, I think you will find that if this progresses as we think, you will find that we continue to be up there in the top 10, as we are in quite a few lists that are, that we continue to be up there, that there are interesting jobs, meaningful jobs, that there are, and that the country, on the other hand, also continues to be an interesting place for people to come and to live. And if you will, I tend to believe that every foreigner that comes here usually gives as much as maybe he or she takes. But I think in general, we actually benefit from people coming here so that we continue to be an interesting country to work in, to play in, and to prosper in. And I think that is what StartUpDelta is doing. It's a rejuvenation, if you will, of entrepreneurship in the largest sense of the world. And one thing that Constantijn mentions, but I think that you may not find clear enough in where you sit, the fact that we have so many good universities in one country, in a relatively small place, Wageningen, Eindhoven, this wonderful university, Rotterdam, Delft. It's an amazing quality to have all those universities here. If a little bit maybe more specialization would happen, as Wageningen is doing, or as Delft is, that would just strengthen this country in particular. Because if there's one thing, if you compare us internationally, we do not have, a university in the top 10 or in the top 20 per se. Now, I'm not saying that is bad as such, but it is something, if there's one improvement we can make, apart from the lifestyle entrepreneurship, maybe it's to focus or to try and improve our universities even further. I think sometimes it's a waste when people feel that, people with a lot of talent feel that they still need to go to the US in order to really be in the biggest place of academia. I think that that's not necessary per se. And sometimes it is, if you have the biggest labs or the biggest computers. We can't pay for everything, that's fine. But you see, Wageningen is attracting the same talent. It's the Harvard of agriculture and food. Now, I think that, or in Utrecht, we have our Nobel Prize winners. I think that's where we could do a little bit more, maybe. But otherwise, generally speaking, I think where you will benefit from a healthy country. I'm not saying healthier per se, but healthy and fit for the 21st century. And I think that's quite an achievement.
I think there's a question there. Just one. What do you think StartUpDelta costs? You said you were paying for it. So what do you think you pay for it?
What do I think I pay for?
What do you think that the public purse pays for StartUpDelta?
That's a tough question. Probably not that much. If it's we're with a lot of people in the Netherlands. So could you give us the answer?
1 to 10 million, more millions, 100 million? No.
No, it's. I think if you look at it net, it's not even 100,000 euros.
No.
So Nelly doesn't get paid. There are civil servants that are redeployed in a special unit, so they are actually on salary already. So basically, it costs the world nothing. If you look at what the return has been, it's quite extraordinary. So if all of the government would work like that, I would say, I'm not part of StartUpDelta, so I'm saying this as a semi-outsider. We're now starting, we're doing the Startup Fest, where 30 different events or even more across the Netherlands, we're really trying to ignite entrepreneurship in the centers of excellence of specific verticals, be it water and clean tech, where Netherlands is very strong, but maybe not as strong in internationalization and in really big scale rollout of our technologies and businesses, in agri-food, in all of these areas. And that's just basically, it's about enabling or empowering those that are in those sectors to do better. And there's no money from the state goes in. Yes, if a province wants to invest, they will do that. But the whole initiative is based on enthusiasm, corporate funding, and everybody basically who thinks and believes that this should happen, that we should be more ambitious, that we should kind of team up around these sectors to provide a better basis for startups in Europe or in the Netherlands, and to be more ambitious, they will invest. So and there's hardly any public money going into it, and that's I think what makes. I ask you this question because I think it's important. This is not about the state doing something. This is really about entrepreneurs and the whole ecosystem around it coming together, doing better, getting higher returns, getting better startups, getting more startups, and getting them grow faster. So
there's an element. There's one other word which is I wish I did have come up with it myself, but it's called social capital. And social capital is the notion that there's a lot of value being created by connecting people. Yeah. And Silicon Valley, one of the lessons from Silicon Valley is exactly that they are able, despite the fact that they may be absolute competitors, that they know each other, that they've worked before in other startups or in other companies, and that in that way they call each other when they need each other, or they meet each other. And whether that's in the pub or at the university, it doesn't make much of a difference. And in that sense, I think what you see to start to happen in the Netherlands as well is this. You get places are being. I should shut up.
No,
there's
no.
questions.
No, please finish your point, and then
Please
we go
finish
to
your
the
point, then we
But
go
this
to
is
the public question.
so one of the things that StartUpDelta has, if you will, galvanized is that this social capital, places where people meet and talk about startups or scale-ups or growth in general, are being created. And I think that again is between universities, between students, and between entrepreneurs and investors. There's an ecosystem starting to exist, and before that it was absent. Okay. Please.
I'm a business manager for an American company. We decided to put our office here in Amsterdam because it's a very good spot for logistics and other stuff, also for talent. And we really like Netherlands. But also I'm an entrepreneur because I'm opening a company called the Algae Factory. We opened it thanks to Start Life of Wageningen, that you should be very proud of this university. But sometimes I feel frustrated because sometimes I have a problem with the Dutch tax authority because everything is in Dutch. Unfortunately, yes, we are in the Netherlands, but the English is the business language. Delta Startup is doing something to address this kind of, not problem, but to facilitate people like me that I'm expat, I cannot speak Dutch, and it's difficult sometimes.
Well, yeah, this is a great example. I mean, and I will, if you haven't done it yourself already, to notify, the tax authority or StartUpDelta, then this is exactly what we can do. Just feed it back. So after this, I'll just send a mail to my friends at StartUpDelta and said, have you ever considered this as a specific point? We actually do see this at the city level much more. Yeah. For instance, I talked to people in The Hague about enabling the expat community, and there you had the same in hospitals, everything was in Dutch, you don't know where to go, and a lot of support services are now coming up. But I think you have a very good point. If that's still the case, it's a bit embarrassing, actually, that it hasn't happened yet.
No, it shouldn't be difficult to. It shouldn't be even difficult. So I agree. It's a bit embarrassing, but it's
like today I got like a fine of 3,000 euro from the tax authority. I cannot talk with them. I need to write down a Dutch letter. So now I need to ask someone to do this. We don't have yet. We have a Dutch team, but why, like an entrepreneur, I cannot open the phone and tell what's the problem? I will pay, but please. Good point. If you want to become international, this is the problem.
It's a good something that should be worked on, I understand from your
answers. A very good point.
There's another question here.
So first, maybe a comment or a question. You mentioned briefly that Nelly is also sort of advising pension funds to invest in funds that then again invest in startups. Isn't that very high risk, something that a pension fund doesn't want to do? And the second question, maybe for you, Mr. Ribbink, is what do you think the role is for universities to sort of stimulate startups being born, if you like? Do you think everyone should apply to a minor entrepreneurship, or is that something different?
First the pension fund, and then the universities.
So she's not advising them. She's basically
Begging.
trying to get them to invest more. They already do that. I mean, they have venture funds, and they're now investing a lot in also abroad. So it's also about getting them to invest more in the Netherlands, not just in America or in other places. And it's they will just make their portfolio judgment. You have a very high risk, low return. A pension fund does that too. And then they will invest in very low risk and low return options. But in the current day and time, those don't exist that much anymore, because they can't invest in bonds. They can't. The stock market isn't that certain, and real estate also has been quite shaky. So they when they determine the mix of different investments, we just want that they consider the kind of venture capital as one of the as one of the options, as one of the asset classes in their total mix, and then preferably that's also in the Netherlands.
Yeah. But to your point, I mean, I've been to the pension funds as well to get money for our fund, and there's two things. There's a risk question, but that's for them internally to decide how to get the returns that their clients need. And then there is the size question. And a pension fund, and Constantijn alluded to it earlier, a pension fund finds it very difficult to even think of anything less than 100 million. Most pension funds have portfolios of hundreds of billions, or at least tens of billions of euros to invest. And so what usually ventures need 5 to 10 millions, and therefore, 100 million is the minimum size they can. Otherwise, they need 3 people to manage the 100 million, and they can do the same. 3 people can actually manage 10 billion, but in a different way. So they tend to invest in tech venture, for example, but they take a US fund or they take an English fund. So the question I think that Nelly would ask is, okay, why English and why American and why not also Dutch? The Danish civil servants pension fund is a huge investor, huge by standards of the technology investment industry. In their portfolio, it's less than 0.3% or something. So we're talking about those levels. But 0.3% over 100 billion is a lot of money. So I think that's the discussion there. And I think in terms of entrepreneurship and universities, this is a very personal answer. I tend not to believe, even though my partner has done a bachelor's in entrepreneurship, that it is something that you can necessarily learn. I mean, writing a business plan, look at the books. I think you can maybe do one mini course in writing a business plan, because you get all the questions. I think a university is a place where you should learn. It's a place where you should experiment, expand your mind, expand your knowledge. I use that time, which is relatively unapplied time, more that way than to, learn 3 years long how to try and start a business. That's a personal opinion. I don't think it's very academic either, by the way. So I think that's fine for non-academic, but I think academic is slightly different. But if you have that entrepreneurial zest, go after it. I mean, in the end, it's not rocket science to start a business, but it's to come up with the right idea and execute it where you have the real science.
What do you think on that, Mr. Van Oranje?
Well, I think that anyone in this room or in this building should be slightly concerned about what technology will do to your job prospects. So if you think that you could become a lawyer and do the basic legal stuff, then forget it. It's going to be automated. And same with your general practitioner. Diagnostics is a decision tree that you can automate that. So a lot of jobs that we know now will be in some way automated. And if you have no knowledge of technology, that's not a good thing. So even if you're a social scientist, you can say, well, no, technology will be applied to your sector in some way. So I would really recommend that, even if it's not in the curriculum, but that you acquaint yourself with technology. Ideally, you can you'd learn a bit of programming and stuff just to understand basically how that world is. And I've tried a bit myself, and I at least got my son now to program, and he's now going to help me, basically polish my skills. But I think that's important, and so to have, as I say, entrepreneurship maybe not an academic activity, but do consider it. And if you have a good idea, go and find a few pals and see if you can develop the idea further, and because it's a good training for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
I think that. Are there any more questions?
Yeah,
oh, there's many more questions. Okay.
One last one.
Well, it's a long-term. I'm curious what your long-term vision is on Dutch society. If half of the people works for startups, can we still maintain our pension scheme? It's also a fundamental change in society. And how do you have views how to prepare our population or our government?
One thing is that we were talking about the definition of startups. We now have this ZZP culture, which is growing tremendously, and it's about, do you want to stay ZZP'er or do you want to grow a business and make it more sustainable? I think the big threat in the first place is a lot of people are ZZP not because they want, but because they can't get employment, and they are very vulnerable. And we see now that their income is declining rapidly, and they're a very vulnerable group of people. So that is a big challenge. So supporting them to be more sustainable entrepreneurs, I think, is important.
But also, just if I heard you correctly, I think you were suggesting that half of Dutch society would be employed as a startup. I think that's neither realistic nor desirable. I think that. I don't think that is any country could have that. If you have 50% of its population or its arbeidsbevolking working for a startup, I don't think would be healthy. Then things would be very individualistic, and lots of society would crumble. But I think the point is much more, let's have more of that culture, let's have a higher percentage of entrepreneurship maybe than we've had before. But I think 50% of society employed in a startup is not necessarily a desirable society, because in my definition of a startup, it has to do with solving problems where the solution is not obvious and there's a risk of failure. Well, those three, and then have 50% of our people working on that, I think is too many. So I think 10-15% maybe, and even that seems like huge numbers. But discount the ZZP'ers who are ZZP'ers because they're not, they would have liked to be employed, but they can't find the right environment at the moment. And
10 or 50%, that's the number.
Perfect. More entrepreneurship, but not too much.
Well,
So, I think that is going to be the end of our interview. So we want to first thank our guests so much. A big round of applause, I think. And of course, a big thanks to the audience for coming and coming up for another session of Room for Discussion. And then our next session will be next week on Wednesday, the 17th of March, about art and whether it's overpriced or priceless. And we will discuss this with the director of the Van Gogh Museum, Axel Ruger, and the director of Christie's, Job Ubbings. So maybe hopefully we will see you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again.